One day Linus came home with his report card. As he turned on the TV, his sister Lucy scoffed at his grade. "You got a C in history? That's only average." Linus defended himself. "So what? I'm an average student in an average school in an average community. What's wrong with being average?" Lucy retorted, "Because you're capable of doing much better." To which Linus sighed and said, "That's the average answer." The sibling quarrel continued when Linus plopped himself on a sofa with his head resting on his right hand, by now regretting talking back to the feisty Lucy, who did not let up. "You think that being average is enough, don't you?" As Linus walked away, Lucy screamed after him, with hands thrown up, "Well, it isn't. What shape would the world be in today if everyone settled for being average?" Finally, Linus turned to ambush a speechless Lucy. What shape is the world in? There's a whole lot of average in the world, isn't there? Much of the world settles for being average. People don't want to be viewed as being below average, but many won't make the effort to be above average. This is true in all areas of life, including religion, including one's relationship with God. In 2 Chronicles chapter 25, we meet a king who could be called average in his relationship with God. Chapter 25, verse 2, after Amaziah is introduced, "He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, but not wholeheartedly." He was average. Amaziah was the worst of the 9 good kings of southern Judah. He was not identical to the bad kings, but almost indistinguishable from them. He was not worse than them, but not much better. He barely made it to the good king list. He just made it just enough to get by. Like Joash before him and Uzziah after him, Amaziah followed a pattern in his relationship with God. First, pride. Second, warning. 3, refusal to listen. And 4, destruction. Martin J. Selman commented that Amaziah did what was right, but not wholeheartedly, aptly summarizes a reign vitiated by compromise. Though he could respect the Mosaic law and respond to prophecy, it is all tinged with mixed motives, and it is no surprise that in the end he turned away from following the Lord. Here is a king introduced to us, Amaziah, and in chapter 25 we read how he followed the law of Moses. He showed mercy on one hand toward some of his enemies. He went out to battle. The Lord said, "Don't use people from Israel." This is the tribe of Judah, so don't use people from Israel. So he did not. But then he decided, I'm going to go to war against Israel. And he basically was told, "You don't need to do that." But I believe he did it anyway. In verse 27, we read a concluding statement about Amaziah. "From the time that Amaziah turned away from following the Lord, they conspired against him in Jerusalem, and he fled to Lachish." Here was a king. He was good part of the time, but not most of the time. He did not really have his heart in his relationship with God, and so he was average, just average. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, verse 9, here are words from David to Solomon, his son. "And you, my son Solomon, acknowledge the God of your father, and serve him with wholehearted devotion and with a willing mind. For the Lord searches every heart and understands every motive behind the thoughts. If you seek him, he will be found by you. But if you forsake him, he will reject you forever." Words of David. David, the man who was described as being a man after God's own heart. David had his problems. We know of his sins. But he was dedicated to following the Lord. He repented of his sins. He sought a relationship with God. And he said to his son Solomon, you need to make sure you have a wholehearted devotion with a willing mind in your relationship with God. Solomon did not listen to his father. He had such a good beginning as king, didn't he? But eventually, his heart was turned away from God. Solomon himself said to Israel, 1 Kings 8:61, but your hearts must be fully committed to the Lord our God, to live by his decrees and obey his commands, as at this time. Solomon did not follow his own instruction. How are we to follow God? How was the person, the child of Israel, to follow God? Notice Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. This was a part of the call to worship, the Shema. God was to be put first. He was to be loved. How was he to be loved? Wholeheartedly, with everything you have. Jesus quoted this verse when asked what the greatest commandment was. We read in Matthew chapter 22 of the incident. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Love the Lord your God. The second is like it, of course, love your neighbor. They go together. But love God completely. Amaziah's problem, the problem of so many people, is that they want a little bit of religion. They want a relationship with God, but they don't want it to consume all their time, all their life. Amaziah had a problem with pride. Verse 19. This was the king of Israel speaking to Amaziah. You say to yourself that you have defeated Edom, and now you are stronger, now you are arrogant and proud. But stay at home. Why ask for trouble and cause your own downfall and that of Judah also? Now Israel had their problems in their relationship with God, didn't they? They were punished before Judah was punished. But the king of Israel was pretty smart on this occasion. Why are you arrogant and proud? He had a military victory. Now he was bothering Israel. And so he is rebuked. Pride causes so many problems. And it will destroy our relationship with God. During the Battle of the Wilderness in the Civil War, Union General John Sedgwick was inspecting his troops. At one point he came to a parapet, over which he gazed out in the direction of the enemy. His officers suggested that this was unwise and perhaps he ought to duck when passing the parapet. Nonsense, replied the general. They couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. He was hit. He fell to the ground, fatally wounded. Amaziah had a problem with pride that kept him from serving God, that kept him from being a good king, a really good king. And then there was the problem of lukewarmness. Amaziah, he wanted to serve God, but he didn't want to serve him wholeheartedly. He was a part-hearted king. What does the Bible say about those that are lukewarm? Very familiar to us is the letter to the church of Laodicea in the book of Revelation. There Jesus says to them, I know your deeds, that you are neither cold nor hot. I wish you were either one or the other. But because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I am about to spit you out of my mouth. Jesus says, either be a follower of mine or don't. Don't do this part-time stuff. Debbie and I had Bill Jones for a number of classes at Oklahoma Christian. I remember one of his statements. He says, some people have just enough religion to make them miserable. Have you ever noticed that? Just enough religion to make you miserable. Amaziah's religion seems more external than internal. And so we could call him the part-hearted king. The part-hearted king. John Mark Hicks commented, externally, he did what was right, but his heart was neither loyal nor committed. His rightness derived from external motives rather than from those of a whole heart. The message of Amaziah to those returning from exile was clear. Listen to God's prophets. Humble yourself before God. Pride can lead to spiritual destruction. There are some things in life, and following God is one of them, certainly. There are some things in life we better do wholeheartedly. We better give it full attention if we're going to do it. Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was flying from New York to Miami. The seasoned and well-trained pilots had been instructed on how to fly the plane. They had done this so many times. As they approached the Miami airport for landing, the indicator light for the landing gear did not come on. The plane flew in a large circle pattern while the crew checked out the light failure. The question was, did the landing gear engage or not? The flight engineer fiddled with the bulb, trying to remove it from the socket, but it would not budge. Soon another of the cockpit crew began to assist. Before long, the entire cockpit crew was eyeballing the light problem. All eyes were on the 79-cent light bulb problem. No one noticed that the plane was losing altitude, not listening to the instructions the pilots knew so well. Above all else, fly the plane. And the plane and many people were lost in the crash of Flight 401. They weren't paying attention to business. When one follows God like Amaziah did, not wholeheartedly, we're not paying attention to what we need to be dwelling on.